Hey guys, I'm Mnar Muhawesh and welcome to another episode of MintPress News' Behind the Headline. We have an awesome show for you guys today, but before we delve into this week's top stories, I wanted to take this opportunity to give a huge shout out and say thank you to the over 80 citizen sponsors who made this show possible. And I also want to extend our gratitude to our featured conscious business sponsor this week, Mystic Man Beard Oil, organic and sustainable personal care inspired by the power and positive influence of the great mystics of history. And if you haven't contributed yet, don't worry, it's not too late. You can also become a sustaining member by visiting our website at mintpressnews.com/donations. Now let's get behind the headline. Outrage overtook the nation earlier this year as we learned that local, state, and federal officials knew about Flint, Michigan's lead-contaminated water supply for nearly a year, but they did nothing to address the deadly problem. But few took note when people converged in Washington to protest radioactive pollution affecting the water of thousands of Native American communities. Even though the level of contamination is far higher and has persisted much longer than the crisis in Flint, there was barely a peep from the mainstream media. Now, since the 1950s, waste from active and inactive uranium mines has seeped into the Navajo Nation's water supplies, which has led to the increased rates of cancer, genetic defects, Navajo DNA depletion, and increases in early mortality. Now, the material that fed the Cold War by making atomic bombs possible is also found in low concentrations of ore, making its runoff a toxic sludge containing other harmful elements like arsenic and lead. Now, it's not just uranium mines that's made the Navajo Nation's water so dangerous, though. Dirty coal-fired power plants have also been major polluters of both water and air throughout the 27,000 square miles that the Navajo Nation occupies in the Southwest. The latest assault, though, on their water came just last year when acid mine drainage, yes, acid, entered the Animas and San Juan rivers following the EPA's reckless attempts to address long-standing issues with the abandoned Gold King mine in Colorado. The spill was so severe that parts of the river turned a bright gold within a day, and the affected area, which passes through 3 states, which has since been declared a disaster zone. The Navajo Nation certainly isn't alone in their fight against repeated violations of the sanctity of their land. Now, the largest proposed mining project in the continent could soon destroy other multiple Native tribes. In December of 2014, we at MintPress reported on a last-minute provision tucked into the National Defense Authorization Act, which would allow for the creation of the continent's largest copper mine in protected national forest in Arizona, part of which includes lands considered sacred by multiple Native American communities. Now, the land at hand involves Oak Flat and Apache Leap, sacred ancestral lands in parts of the Tonto National Forest from which Apache communities had been forcibly removed. And in 1955, federal law closed the land to mining out of respect for the Apache's spiritual ties to the land and concerns about water safety. The plan for the proposed copper mine at the time had been rejected by Congress and even opposed by tribes for years. Yet once it was hidden away in the fine print of the mammoth annual document that funds the Pentagon, the previously protected Apache land could soon be handed over to Resolution Copper Mining, and these tribes could soon face a water poisoning disaster that's far worse than Flint, and one comparable to the Navajo Nations. It's important to consider who snuck the policy rider into the NDAA. 2 of the plan's greatest champions are none other than Arizona Republican Senators John McCain and Jeff Flake. Both of them have received campaign contributions from Rio Tinto, the British-Australian mining giant which owns Resolution Copper. Flake even worked as a lobbyist for Rio Tinto. And indeed, the law does mandate environmental impact studies and tribal consultations, but here's the deal. The law is worded in a way that Resolution would receive the land for mining regardless of the outcomes of those environmental assessments and consultations. Now, what's worse, though, is that the law doesn't include any penalties, none, for the company for any future environmental or cultural harms in the area, leaving the Apaches themselves, not the mining giant nor the lawmakers, to deal with the aftermath. And once the scope of the provision became apparent, Apaches decided to occupy Oak Flat. They stayed there for months last summer, refusing to leave. And their tenacity ignited a growing movement against the land swap, with over 100,000 signatures on a Stop Apache Land Grab petition to the White House, and at least 1 million other people calling on Congress to repeal the deal. Now, only time will tell what the impact of this pushback will be. People have enormous power, but unfortunately, so do corporations and the lawmakers who support them instead of working for the public they're elected to represent. If the mine begins operating, it seems almost inevitable that the effects will play out as dangerously as they have for the Navajo Nation. And just like the people of Flint, Apaches and Navajos will have to scramble to secure emergency supplies of fresh drinking water. But unlike Flint, their plight will go largely unnoticed by the mainstream media. And Madonna and Michael Moore won't be sending in bottled water by the busload to Apache school children. Racism against Native Americans will persist as America's silent genocide of Native communities continues. Welcome back, everyone. Maybe you haven't noticed, but Washington is occupied by neocons. Seeking world domination, they are steering the U.S. empire toward endless wars abroad, and back at home, they feed us with an illusion of freedom, democracy, and choice presented by the two-party system. Now, they may seem like two distinct parties, but make no mistake about it, the Democratic and Republican parties function more like a single party that promotes the interests of corporations, special interest groups, and foreign governments, all of which profit from more war and human exploitation. But perhaps nowhere are the similarities more striking than the past two neocon administrations to occupy the White House. The grand old party's George W. Bush declared the war on terror, then gave the world the Iraq War, Guantanamo Bay, CIA black sites, and a drone program, among a host of other ills. And seizing on the American people's weariness of military adventurism abroad, Barack Obama got himself on the Democratic ticket in 2008, campaigning on a platform of change and hope. But that change never really came to pass. Obama, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, dropped over 23,000 bombs on the Middle East in 2015 alone. Guantanamo remains open, and Bush's drone program across Africa and the Middle East has grown even more deadly. Obama even out-Bushed W by expanding the war on terror to benefit the military-industrial complex. He allowed for the strengthening of extreme right-wing militias and governments, the emboldening of Gulf monarchies and apartheid Israel, and the development of a foreign policy agenda that's ironically become increasingly aligned with our sworn enemy, Al-Qaeda. Sure, the Iran deal was finally secured under Obama, but the Russian bear was also provoked under his watch with the destabilization of Ukraine, reigniting the Cold War. Now, here to talk to me more about the neocon Republicans and Democrats pulling the strings in Washington is Daniel McAdams, director of the Ron Paul Institute for Peace, a nonpartisan initiative led by former politicians, policy advisors, and even former Bush aides who oppose U.S. interventionism and work to educate the public about the neocon takeover of America. And I began by asking him who exactly are the neocons working behind the scenes, and how did they get so deeply embedded in Washington? Take a look.
Well, we could talk a long time about the origins of the neocons. Intellectually, they began in New York, in a small part of New York, many decades ago, and they came out of very left-wing Trotskyite circles. They slowly migrated from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. There, of course, was a big migration under Reagan, where they found themselves all of a sudden placed in positions of relative power. I don't know whether I don't think Reagan was a neocon for all of his other faults, but I think he was certainly infiltrated by the neocon establishment. They have continued in their positions. As a matter of fact, the second generation of neocons, Bill Kristol, who of course is the son of Irving Kristol, John Podhoretz, whose father, of course, is one of the original neocons. The second generation has taken over, and now we're actually seeing a third generation of neocons, the younger and much more aggressive group of neocons. And these are people like Eli Lake, Jamie Kirchick, Michael Weiss. Foreign Policy Initiative is one of their home bases. That was originally the Project for a New American Century, PNAC, which was Bill Kristol's outfit, which their big role was in pushing the Iraq War. Starting in the mid-90s, they were pushing for this war. And then, of course, as soon as 9/11 happened, most of the Pentagon wanted to attack Afghanistan, but the neocons said, no, forget that. We need to go after Iraq. So why are they so dangerous? Because they promote war. They promote what they call democracy at the barrel of a U.S. gun. It causes millions of people to be not only killed, but maimed and have their lives ruined overseas. Thousands of Americans die in their ridiculous no-win wars. And it also has emptied the U.S. economy of trillions of dollars. So they're hell-bent on bankrupting our country, creating thousands and millions of new enemies overseas. They don't keep us safe. They make things worse. Unfortunately, they still dominate Washington.
And how does the two-party system encourage or even fulfill this neocon agenda for more war?
Well, neocons, in a way, can be very good chameleons. They are certainly comfortable in either party, and they love to whisper in the ears of people in power. Look, even just in the Obama administration, you see several prominent neocons. Let's just look at Victoria Nuland, who was the Assistant Secretary of State for Europe. Very, very important and powerful position. Well, she served as a top advisor to Dick Cheney, who everyone knows as a top neocon. She seamlessly moved over to the Obama administration, and she's the one who got us mixed up in this overthrow of the Ukrainian government, which has not turned out very well at all. Her husband, ironically enough, Robert Kagan, is from a whole family of neocons, and Kagan was, of course, the top advisor in the Bush administration, and then he went over to advise Hillary Clinton in the State Department. So you see them prominently in the Republican Party, but I think there's a group that will go equally to either party, but there's also a group that you see predominantly in the Democratic Party, and these would be called liberal interventionists, R2P, people, responsibility to protect people. They have the same philosophy, which is that you must use force to remake the world in our image. And these people would be like Susan Rice, Samantha Power, the U.S. ambassador to the UN. They're the ones who would be explaining the bombing of Syria or the undermining of Syria, the attack on Libya. They would be explaining it not in terms of realpolitik, but it's going to be good for the local people. Well, I think if you ask anyone who's been liberated in Libya how they like their wonderful new country, they won't answer, thank you very much, neocons. Thank you, liberal interventionists. The same is true in Iraq. So they easily migrate to all parties that are considered the experts in Washington, sadly enough, and strangely and crazily enough, because they're always wrong about everything.
Right, and I'm really glad you mentioned that, because now, from what I'm following, the Ron Paul Institute of Peace has been one of the most outspoken organizations against U.S. wars and empire building, and has even gone as far as to reject the hate and xenophobia and Islamophobia being spewed by so many so-called liberty-minded individuals like Donald Trump and Alex Jones. This, of course, is not just a phenomenon that has, hit the liberty movement, but also the new atheist leftist movement. So why are people on the left and the right latching on to such a divide and conquer tactic by the establishment? Yeah,
that's a good question. I think our tactic at the Ron Paul Institute would be, whatever the opposite of divide and conquer is, because as you point out, we brought in not only people from the Bush administration. I'm thinking particularly of the Leverets, who were both in the national security establishment in the Bush administration. They resigned in protest over the Iraq War. There were several others. We also have Dennis Kucinich, who's a well-known progressive who shares our views about foreign policy. And so we're happy to be absolutely not even nonpartisan, beyond partisan, because that is really where the strength is. People who don't identify with either side, but I just identify with the idea of peace. As to why there are people who might want to be thought of as liberty-minded, nevertheless promoting war, the names that you brought out, I would definitely say are not in our camp. But I also think someone like Ted Cruz, who loves to pretend that he wants all the Ron Paul voters to vote for him, then he says things like he wants to make the sand glow in the dark in the Middle East. What a horrific Nazi-esque kind of statement. There are thousands of innocent people that would be killed if he tried something like this. So what is their appeal? I think Americans are very, very, very confused. We saw this recently just in the New Hampshire primary, where the anti-established candidates, regardless of their positions, all of a sudden came to the front. They're confused, and they have a sense that something is wrong, but they don't understand why. They don't understand that the Federal Reserve is printing the money for these wars and thus undermining the currency, making the 1% all the more richer, making the military-industrial complex and the banksters all the richer. Well, the middle class and working class gets poorer and poorer. They don't understand it's the Federal Reserve's fault. They don't understand how the neocons are promoting war and getting wealthy doing it. They just see that their paychecks are shrinking due to inflation and other things. So, unfortunately, the mainstream media plays a great role in deceiving the American people. We don't really have a free press, at least among the mainstream in America. And so they want to tell Americans, well, it's all the Muslims' fault. It's all the immigrants' fault. It's all the fault of these wimpy left-wingers who don't want to bomb everyone. And people, sadly, although thankfully we have the internet, we have organizations like yours and others who are promoting peace, but it's a very, very difficult thing to break through the propaganda bullhorn of the mainstream media in the United States.
Right, and considering, the work that you've done with the Ron Paul campaign for president several years ago, what's preventing third-party candidates from challenging this establishment system, and what's stopping them from mounting powerful, viable campaigns that catch attention at a national level?
Well, I was actually in Ron Paul's congressional office on Capitol Hill, so I was not involved with the campaign per se, but I certainly was observing what was happening. And interestingly enough, after the 2008 campaign, Ron Paul got together the so-called minor party candidates, and they all sat down from Chuck Baldwin on the right to Cynthia McKinney on the left, whatever those two terms mean. They sat down and agreed on a set of basic principles on non-interventionism, on the Federal Reserve, and on deficit spending. And it was really a remarkable achievement, and that was sort of the model for what we wanted to do with the Institute, is to capture that idea. The problem for third parties in America is very simply money and lack of real democracy, for lack of a better term, in the United States. If you want to get on the ballot as a third-party candidate, you have to spend millions of dollars just getting ballot access in the United States. And even if somehow you do that, you spend so much money getting on the ballot, then you've got to deal with the Republicans and Democrats, whether they'll let you in the debate or not. You won't even exist. The media will ignore you. So it really is one of the problems why there is no real debate in foreign policy. Imagine if in Congress there were 3 or 4 different parties. Imagine the kinds of coalitions that could build around certain issues. They may not all agree on one issue, but on other issues they would get together. You would really see a breakup of the stranglehold on the rest of us. But sadly, until there are some fundamental changes in the U.S. electoral system, I'm not very optimistic that we will be able to break out of their R's and D's.
Well, thank you so much, Daniel, for joining me today. Hopefully we'll have you on again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
According to the American Civil Liberties Union, the Obama administration has prosecuted more whistleblowers than any other administration in U.S. history, making America one of the most dangerous places for those who expose government crimes. Think of Edward Snowden and Julian Assange, who have gone to great lengths to avoid what fate may await them on U.S. soil. But others, like Chelsea Manning, have not been so lucky to avoid that fate. She's serving a 35-year sentence in a military prison facility in Fort Leavenworth for orchestrating the largest leak of classified information the world has ever seen. And while working as an Army intelligence analyst in Iraq, Manning downloaded and shared with WikiLeaks videos of the 2007 Baghdad airstrike and the 2009 Grenada airstrike. 500,000 Army reports that would later make up the Iraq war logs and the Afghan war diary, in addition to the 250,000 American diplomatic cables, all of which was meant to be hidden from the public eye. Now, rather than being hailed as a patriot and a defender of democracy for revealing the true costs of war, including civilian casualties, uninvestigated torture reports, contractor abuse, and even the role of corporate interests in international diplomacy, Manning was placed in solitary confinement in extreme conditions for 3 years. And in 2013, she was sentenced to 35 years in a military prison, along with a dishonorable discharge from the Army. But this harsh sentence for a nonviolent crime set a very dangerous precedent for whistleblowers. And here to talk to me more about Chelsea Manning and this case is Kevin Gosztola, editor of ShadowProof.com, and a journalist who regularly covers WikiLeaks, whistleblowing, secrecy, and various issues created by the national security state. Kevin even had the opportunity to exchange a few letters with Manning to share her story with the public. And I began by asking him why human rights organizations like Amnesty International don't even consider Chelsea Manning a political prisoner, despite the fact that if she was imprisoned in any other country for the same reason, she probably would. Take a look.
Amnesty's provided some support. I think the issue here is that, broadly speaking, there is no regard for her as a political prisoner because, quite frankly, Amnesty International and a lot of human rights organizations probably are far more comfortable with elevating the cases of political prisoners in other countries outside of the United States. It's very uncomfortable, I think, for domestic human rights organizations to believe that there are people here in the U.S. that are political prisoners.
Right. Manning was behind the single largest leak of classified material to the public, particularly about U.S. involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan and possibly, war crimes that were committed during that time. For this, she's been jailed in a military facility, but does her legacy extend beyond the leaks? What are the impacts of her imprisonment itself?
So there are two levels that I will answer this question. First is a less political, but it's also very important because one thing is that her identity as a trans woman inside of the facility is reshaping the way that the military handles prisoners. It's opening up the possibility for people who have what she had, which was gender identity disorder, to come out and get hormone treatment and to be treated like human beings rather than have their dignity trampled upon while they're in a military facility. On a more political sense, the effect of Chelsea Manning's disclosures and the act that she engaged in is quite profound. As one of the more common-sided impacts of her disclosures is that it opened up space for a lot of the uprisings that were seen in the Middle East back in 2011. That there were Egyptians and Tunisians and there were even Libyans that were reading the U.S. diplomatic cables between the State Department officials, the diplomats, and then the heads of states in those countries, and seeing the massive corruption that was endemic in their countries. And it's been really crucial to look at, the different sets of documents. Just to be quickly clear with people who maybe aren't aware, the different sets are that we had military war logs from Iraq. We had war logs, military incident reports from Afghanistan. There were hundreds of thousands of diplomatic cables. There were detainee assessment briefs on each of the prisoners that have been held at Guantanamo Bay. There was also the collateral murder video, which was this very vivid military dash cam sort of video of the attack on a Reuters journalist and then some other innocent civilians inside of Baghdad. And all of this information collectively has added so much to our understanding of the United States.
Right, and I'm really glad that you mentioned, transgender rights. How has Chelsea Manning, become a role model for transgender individuals?
Chelsea Manning inside of Fort Leavenworth has been quite profound for trans people here in the U.S. I think that she's actually a kind of role model to trans people. And I had a letter exchange with her, and she didn't see herself as a role model. But in my mind, one of the worst places to be a trans person would be in the U.S. military, inside of a prison where you are not allowed to be the person you want to be, where you're not allowed to be yourself, basically. And she's showing trans people who are writing to her, sharing their stories. She's showing them how to live and be themselves.
Right. I mean, considering the precedent this has set for all whistleblowers, why do you think the mainstream media and some politicians are turning to the ad hominem attacks and calling, whistleblowers like Chelsea Manning, un-American or unpatriotic? What do you have to say about that?
The media should see these people as sources, not as people who should be attacked for going out and making statements. But a lot of the times you look at the coverage and they're treated like they're egomaniacs, or they're treated like they're out for some kind of personal fame. Instead, the reality is that they've done this truth-telling at great risk to themselves. Just take Kiriakou is a more minor case when compared to Chelsea Manning, but he ended up going to jail and serving a sentence of 30 months in prison, all because he confirmed the name of an agent to a reporter, which is something that I would say a lot of people in government do all the time. In fact, we've had other officials in government that have leaked far worse information, potentially jeopardizing people who were undercover agents, and they've never been prosecuted. So the problem for the media is that they have this access to powerful individuals at the top. And those powerful individuals at the top are called into question by people like Thomas Drake, John Kiriakou, Edward Snowden, and Chelsea Manning. And in order to maintain this sort of access, in order to continue to be the sort of elite kind of journalists that they want to be, they end up having to trash these people and convince Americans that these are not individuals we should listen to.
Well, thank you so much, Kevin, for joining us today. National Security State journalist and editor of ShadowProof.com. Hopefully we'll have you on again soon. Thank you. Thank you again for joining us today. That's all for today's episode, but I'll be continuing this conversation on Twitter, and you can follow me at Mnar, M-U-H. And until then, we'll see you next week.